Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Now, we looked at Y parameters where the voltages are taken as independent variables and currents as dependent variables, and Z parameters where the currents were independent variables and the voltages were the result of those currents. Now, there is no need to take voltages on both sides to be independent variables or currents on both sides, we can mix and match. Now, let us say we have a 2-port and we think of applying a current to port 1 and a voltage to port 2. Okay. Now, the voltage here V1 and the current over there I2 will also be linear combinations of independent sources that are applied. Okay. And in this particular case, when we take I1, that is current on port 1 and the voltage on port 2, the set of parameters we get are called H parameters. Okay. So, we have V1 to be H11 I1 plus H12 V2, and we have I2 to be H21 I1 plus H22 V2. Okay. In other words, this vector V1 I2 equals H11, H12, H21, H22 times the vector I1 V2. Okay. Now, this is denoted by the letter H to denote that they are hybrid. Okay. So, these are known as hybrid parameters, and they are hybrid parameters because this voltage equals H11 times a current. So, H11 has dimensions of resistance. This voltage equals H12 times V2. So, H12 is dimensionless. Okay. So, this has dimensions of resistance, that is dimensionless. This is obviously for dimensional consistency. And similarly, in the second expression, I2 equals H21 times I1. So, this has to be dimensionless H21. So, this is also dimensionless, and finally, this is a current equaling something times a voltage. So, H22 has dimensions of conductance. Okay. So, the 4 parameters do not have the same dimensions. So, they are called hybrid parameters. Okay. Now, evaluation of this is exactly in the same way as earlier. You set one of the independent variables to 0 and evaluate them. As before, you can take 4 different sets of the independent variables and evaluate everything, but the most convenient thing is to set one of them to be 0. Okay. So, in the first case we set V2 to 0, which means you short circuit port number 2 and you apply I1 to this side and you measure V1 and I2. Okay. So, what do we get with V2 set to 0? We have V1 to be H11 I1. In other words, H11 is simply V1 by I1, or the resistance looking into port 1 with port 2 short circuited. Okay. And similarly, we have from the second equation, I2 is H21 times I1, or H21 is simply I2 by I1, that is the current gain from port 1 to port 2 with port 2 short circuited. Okay. So, this is resistance looking into port 1 with port 2 short circuited, and H21 is the current gain from port 1 to port 2 with port 2 shorted. Okay. The general principle is always the same. You set one of the independent variables to 0 and apply a stimulus on the other side and evaluate two of the parameters. Okay. And similarly, we set I1 to 0, which means we are open circuiting port 1. Okay. If I set I1 to 0, it means that port 1 is open circuited, and then you apply V2 and you measure both I2 and V1. So, V1 would be just H12 times V2, because I1 is 0, and from this we get H12 to be V1 by V2 with port 1 open circuited. Okay. And this is nothing but, this is called the inverse voltage gain, that is the voltage gain from port 2 to port 1. With port 1 open circuited, and we get I2 to be H22 times V2. In other words, H22 is I2 by V2 with I1 set to 0 or port 1 open circuited, and H22 is nothing but conductance looking into port 2 with port 1 open circuited. Okay. So, these are the hybrid parameters. Now, it turns out that these hybrid parameters were useful for describing a particular type of transistor. Like I said, you could use any parameter set for any element. Sometimes some of them will have infinite values and not useful. And even when all of them do exist, some are more convenient than others. Now, previously there was a particular type of transistor known as the bipolar junction transistor. To describe the small signal model of the bipolar junction transistor, these H parameters were widely used, but actually the current style is to use Y parameters, the admittance parameters for both the bipolar transistor and the MOS transistor. Okay. So, you will see those things when you take a course on active circuits, that is amplifiers using bipolar transistors and MOS transistors. Okay.